But each melody brings to light dark secrets that should have been forgotten. The mansion fills with mysteries, threats, and revelations that put her life at risk. And when the last note echoes, nothing will be the same again. If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing. The afternoon sun lazily penetrated through the heavy velvet curtains of the Thompson mansion, casting elongated shadows across the noble wooden floor, already worn by time. Martha Johnson, with her well-lived 55 years, and 15 of them, dedicated to caring for this stately house, pensively observed the immense grand piano that dominated the main room. The instrument, covered by a thin layer of dust, seemed to be in a deep sleep, waiting for the moment to awaken. "Martha, come here." The voice of Mr. Edward Thompson, the current owner of the mansion, echoed through the corridors. At 90 years old, he still maintained a surprising authority in his tone, even though his body already showed the natural frailty of age. Adjusting her impeccably white apron, Martha headed to the study on the second floor. The room, like the rest of the house, breathed history. Bookshelves crammed with volumes covered the walls from floor to ceiling, and a majestic mahogany desk occupied the center of the room. "Please sit down," requested Mr. Thompson, indicating a leather armchair. His blue eyes, still vivid despite his age, shone with a peculiar intensity. "I have a proposal for you." Martha settled into the armchair, intrigued. In all her years of service, she was rarely invited to sit during a conversation with her employer. "As you know, I don't have much time left," he began, his firm voice contrasting with the fragility of his hands resting on the desk. "And there's something I need very much before I depart." "You shouldn't talk like that," interrupted Martha, genuinely concerned about the man who, despite the formality of their relationship, had become a sort of father figure over the years. No, let me finish," he insisted, raising a wrinkled hand. "I want you to learn to play the piano, and it's not a simple request, it's a condition." Martha blinked several times, trying to process what she had just heard. "Condition? Condition for what, Mr. Thompson?" "To receive your share of the inheritance," he replied, an enigmatic smile playing on his lips. The shock made Martha straighten up in the armchair. "Inheritance? But I'm just your housekeeper." "You are much more than that, my dear. 15 years of dedication cannot be summed up as just a housekeeper." He paused, his eyes losing themselves for a moment in some distant memory. "Besides, there's something I need to confirm, and I can only do that through music." "But Mr. Thompson, I've never played piano in my life. I don't even know how to read sheet music," she protested, still stunned by the turn her life had just taken. "You'll have the best lessons. I'll hire Professor Albert Miller, one of the most respected in the city, and you'll start tomorrow," he declared, his voice leaving no room for arguments. "The only condition is that you must play for me every night, even if it's just one note at the beginning." Martha felt an inexplicable shiver run down her spine. There was something in Mr. Thompson's gaze, a mixture of anxiety and expectation, that went beyond the simple desire to hear music. "And how long do I have to learn?" she asked, already surrendering to the idea. "As long as necessary," he replied, smiling again. "But there's one piece in particular that I want to hear. When you're ready, of course." That night, after finishing her usual tasks, Martha stayed, longer than usual, in the main room, observing the piano. Under the moonlight entering through the tall windows, the instrument seemed to come to life, its ivory keys shining as if they held secrets. She approached cautiously, and for the first time in 15 years pressed a key. The solitary note echoed through the silent mansion, and for a moment Martha could have sworn she heard a sigh coming from upstairs. The next day, when Professor Miller arrived for her first lesson, Martha noticed that Mr. Thompson was watching, everything from his favorite armchair, with an expression that mixed anxiety and something else, something she couldn't define. Was it fear? The first out-of-tune notes filled the room, and Martha realized she was embarking on a journey that would change her life forever. What she didn't know yet was that each key of that piano held not just musical notes but also secrets that had been waiting for decades for the right moment to come to light. The weeks that followed fell into an unusual routine for Martha. Her mornings, previously dedicated to organizing the mansion, were now divided with piano lessons. Professor Miller, a middle-aged gentleman with admirable patience, guided her inexperienced fingers through the keys with paternal dedication. Music isn't just about technique, he explained, adjusting Martha's posture on the piano bench. It's about feeling each note, each pause, each sigh of the instrument. During one of these lessons, while trying to execute a simple exercise, Martha noticed something strange. One of the keys, when pressed, produced a slightly different sound, as if something was interfering with its mechanism. When she mentioned this to the professor, he examined the interior of the piano with professional attention. "Curious," he murmured. "There seems to be something." Before he could complete the phrase, they were interrupted by the abrupt arrival of Mr. Thompson, who entered the room leaning on his noble wooden cane. "Any problem with the piano?" he asked, his voice betraying unusual anxiety. "Nothing significant," replied the professor, quickly closing the lid of the instrument. "Just a small natural misalignment due to time." Martha couldn't help but notice the exchange of glances between the two men. There was something unspoken hanging in the air, an almost palpable tension that left her intrigued. That night, after dinner, while serving tea to Mr. Thompson in his study, she decided to satisfy her growing curiosity. "Mr. Thompson, why is this piano so important to you?" The old man stopped with the cup halfway to his lips, his blue eyes clouding with distant memories. "This piano, Martha, belonged to someone very special, someone who changed the course of many lives in this house." "The former owner," she ventured, remembering the occasional comments about a woman who had lived there decades ago. "Sarah," he whispered, the name escaping like a prayer. "Sarah Thompson. She was extraordinary." Martha felt her heart quicken. It was the first time in 15 years that she had heard Mr. Thompson mention this name. "She used to play every night," he continued, his voice choked with emotion. "She had a unique talent, something that went beyond technique. When her hands touched these keys, it was as if time stood still." "What happened to her?" Martha asked cautiously. Mr. Thompson placed the cup on the table with trembling hands. "She left a long time ago, but before that she composed a piece, a single piece that was never played for anyone but me." At this moment, they were interrupted by a commotion on the lower floor. Altered voices echoed through the corridor, and hurried footsteps climbed the main staircase. "Dad!" a female voice resounded through the house. "Dad, where are you?" Mr. Thompson's face visibly paled. "Rebecca," he murmured, "my daughter has returned." Rebecca Thompson, a woman in her 50s, burst into the study like a tropical storm. Her high heels struck the wooden floor hard, and her expensive perfume permeated the environment. "What's this story about piano lessons for the maid?" she demanded, without even greeting her father. "Victor called me telling me about this absurdity. Have you lost your mind?" "Rebecca, my daughter," replied Mr. Thompson with forced calm. "Your manners. Martha is practically family." "Family?" Rebecca laughed scornfully. "She's a maid, Dad. And now they tell me that you intend to include her in the will. This is ridiculous." Martha felt her face burn with shame and indignation. She wanted to defend herself, but years of service had taught her her place in that house. "What I do with my assets is my decision," declared Mr. Thompson, his voice regaining its old authority. "And my reasons are private." Rebecca narrowed her eyes, studying her father with a calculating expression. "Victor is coming here, and he'll bring our lawyer. This won't stand, Dad." When Rebecca left, leaving a trail of tension in the air, Martha began to discreetly withdraw, but Mr. Thompson's voice stopped her. "Don't give up on the lessons," he asked, almost pleadingly. "There's much more at stake than you imagine, much more than any inheritance." That night, alone in her room at the back of the mansion, Martha found a mysterious envelope under her door. Inside, there was a yellowed sheet music with a single phrase handwritten at the top. "For when the truth needs to be revealed, Sarah." The arrival of Victor Thompson at the mansion. 2 days later, brought with it an even tenser atmosphere. Mr. Thompson's nephew, a 40-year-old man with an artificial smile and restless eyes, settled into the guest room as if the house already belonged to him. By his side, Dr. Marcus Vance, a lawyer of austere appearance, always carried a black briefcase close to his body. Martha observed the changes in the house's dynamics with growing apprehension. During her daily tasks, she caught fragments of whispered conversations between Rebecca and Victor, conspiratorial glances exchanged with the lawyer, and mysterious phone calls made from the library. "The old man is senile, obviously," she heard Victor say one morning as she passed through the corridor with the coffee tray. First that story about Sarah and now this, giving part of the inheritance to a maid. It's absurd. "We need to act quickly," Rebecca replied, her voice laden with bitterness. "Before he does something irreversible." Martha felt a knot in her stomach. The sheet music she had found still burned in her memory, carefully hidden among her clothes. During her piano lessons, which now took place under the disapproving glances of Rebecca and Victor, she couldn't help but think about the meaning of that document. Professor Miller, always sensitive to changes in his students' mood, noticed her distraction during one of the lessons. "Something's bothering you," he commented, as he adjusted her hands on the keys. Martha hesitated for a moment, but something in the professor's understanding look encouraged her. "Professor, did you know Sarah Thompson?" The professor's hands trembled slightly, and he adjusted his glasses with a nervous gesture. "Sarah. That's a name I haven't heard in a long time," he replied, lowering his voice. "She was an exceptional student. In fact, she was the one who recommended me to this house many years ago. Do you know why she left?" The professor looked around, making sure they were alone. "There are stories, Martha. Stories that people prefer to forget. But the piano never forgets." Before he could elaborate, they were interrupted by Victor, who entered the room with his domineering presence. "How much longer is this charade going to last?" he questioned, addressing the professor. "My uncle is paying a fortune for these useless lessons." "Mr. Victor," replied the professor with dignity, "music cannot be rushed. Each student has their own time." "Time is precisely what we don't have," muttered Victor, casting a significant look at Martha. That afternoon, while cleaning the piano, Martha noticed something even stranger. The key that previously produced a different sound now seemed slightly loose. Carefully, she examined it more closely and noticed a small crack in the wood, as if something was hidden inside the instrument itself. Her heart raced when her fingers touched something inside the opening. It seemed to be a small secret compartment. But before she could investigate further, she heard footsteps approaching and quickly moved away from the piano. Rebecca entered the room, accompanied by Dr. Vance. "Ah, you're here," she said disdainfully. "Dad is calling for you in the study. It seems we need to have a conversation due as a family." The ironic tone in the word family did not go unnoticed. Martha climbed the stairs with a heavy heart, feeling that she was about to face something bigger than she imagined. In the study, she found Mr. Thompson sitting in his armchair, looking more fragile than ever. Victor was standing by the window, and Dr. Vance was organizing some documents on the desk. "Martha," began Mr. Thompson, his voice trembling, "I need to tell you something important. Something about Sarah, about the piano, and about why you're here." But before he could continue, Rebecca interrupted him abruptly. "Dad, the doctor brought the documents we discussed. I think we'd better resolve this first." Martha observed the power play unfolding before her, realizing that each person in that room seemed to have their own hidden agenda. What none of them knew was that, hidden in her room, there was a sheet music that could change everything, if she could decipher it in time. Mr. Thompson's study was plunged into a tense silence. Dr. Vance slid a set of documents across the mahogany desk, the sound of paper against wood echoing like a harbinger of change. "They're just preventive measures," explained the lawyer, his voice modulated in a professional tone. "Considering the current circumstances." Martha observed Mr. Thompson examining the papers with trembling hands. His blue eyes, normally so lively, seemed lost somewhere distant. "Preventive measures?" he questioned, raising his gaze to the lawyer. "It seems more like an attempt to Declare me incapable." Rebecca quickly approached, placing a hand on her father's shoulder. "Dad, it's for your own good. These recent decisions, this obsession with the piano, we're concerned." "Concerned about my sanity or my inheritance?" retorted Mr. Thompson, momentarily regaining his old strength. Victor, who had remained silent by the window until then, intervened. "Uncle Edward, be reasonable. This erratic behavior, these stories about Sarah—" "Sarah is not a story," thundered Mr. Thompson, pounding the table with surprising force. The sound reverberated through the room, making everyone startle. Taking advantage of the momentary confusion, Martha tried to discreetly withdraw, but Mr. Thompson's voice stopped her. "Stay, Martha. You, more than anyone here, need to hear this." At that moment, they were interrupted by the unexpected arrival of Professor Miller. His normally serene face was marked by an unusual urgency. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, "but there's something I need to show. Something I found inside the piano." Rebecca advanced, trying to prevent him from approaching the desk. "Anything related to this house must first go through Dr. Vance." "Not this time," intervened Mr. Thompson, his voice regaining authority. "Professor, please continue." The professor pulled a yellowed envelope from his pocket, similar to the one Martha had found days before. "During the piano maintenance, I discovered this. They're old documents, Mr. Thompson. Documents that prove that Sarah—" "Enough," interrupted Victor, advancing threateningly. "This is ridiculous. We can't allow old stories to destroy this family." "Family?" questioned Mr. Thompson with a bitter laugh. "You speak of family, Victor, but do you know the meaning of that word? Sarah knew, and she paid a high price for it." Martha, observing the scene, felt her hands tingle with the memory of the sheet music hidden in her room. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly fitting together in her mind. "Mr. Thompson," she spoke up, gathering courage, "the sheet music I found, does it have something to do with this?" The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Thompson's face lit up with sudden understanding, while Rebecca and Victor exchanged alarmed looks. "You found the sheet music?" he asked, leaning forward in his armchair. "Sarah's composition." "I found it under my door a few days ago," she replied, feeling the weight of the gazes upon her. "It's signed by her, with a message." "Impossible!" exclaimed Rebecca. "All of Sarah's sheet music was destroyed after her departure. I made sure of that myself." "Not all of it," murmured Professor Miller, an enigmatic smile playing on his lips. "Sarah was smarter than you imagined." Mr. Thompson slowly rose from his armchair, leaning on his cane. "Martha, I want you to play that sheet music, now." "But she barely knows how to play," protested Victor. "It's impossible for her to execute a complete piece." "It's not a common piece," explained the professor. "It's a message. Sarah transformed the truth into music, knowing that one day someone would be able to decipher it." Martha felt a shiver run down her spine. The weight of responsibility, the tension in the room, the looks of expectation and fear, everything converged on this moment. "Dr. Vance," said Mr. Thompson, "I suggest you keep your documents for now. There's a story that needs to be told first, a story that began 60 years ago when this piano arrived at this house, bringing with it much more than music." Everyone headed to the piano room, a tense and silent procession through the corridors of the mansion. The afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the room with colored patches that danced on the grand piano. Martha sat at the instrument, her hands trembling slightly as she positioned the mysterious sheet music on the stand. Professor Miller stood beside her, ready to assist. "You don't need to play perfectly," he whispered. "Just follow the main notes. Sarah knew what she was doing when she composed this." Rebecca and Victor remained near the door like nervous sentinels, while Dr. Vance observed everything with professional interest, his black briefcase still firmly held in his hands. Mr. Thompson settled into his favorite armchair, the one from which he used to observe the lessons. His eyes never left the piano, as if he expected the instrument itself to start revealing its secrets. "Before Martha begins," he said, his voice laden with emotion, "you need to understand who Sarah was. She wasn't just a talented pianist. She was the true heir to this house." A murmur of surprise ran through the room. Rebecca stepped forward, indignant. What are you talking about, Dad? The house has always belonged to the Thompsons. Yes, confirmed Mr. Thompson with a sad smile. But not in the way you think. Sarah was a Thompson, the only daughter of my older brother, Richard. Victor visibly paled. But you always said your brother never had children. That's what everyone was supposed to believe, continued Mr. Thompson. Richard fell in love with a pianist, a woman considered unsuitable by the family. They married in secret, and Sarah was born far from here. When Richard fell ill, he made me promise to protect his daughter. Martha began to play the first notes of the sheet music, a simple but deeply emotional melody. Mr. Thompson closed his eyes, letting himself be carried away by the music. Sarah came to live here after her parents' disappearance, he continued. No one knew her true identity except me. She grew up in this house, developed her talent at the piano, and discovered the truth about her inheritance through old documents kept by her father. The melody began to gain complexity, intertwined, notes that seemed to tell their own story. Professor Miller occasionally guided Martha's hands, helping her maintain the rhythm. But then, interrupted Rebecca, her voice trembling, if she was the true heir, why did she leave? Because someone discovered the truth, replied Professor Miller, without taking his eyes off the sheet music. Someone who didn't want Richard's will to be revealed. Dr. Vance cleared his throat, adjusting his tie uncomfortably. Mr. Thompson, perhaps it's not prudent to continue with these revelations without proper legal analysis. Sir, protested Mr. Thompson, I've kept this secret for too long. Sarah composed this piece on the night she was forced to leave. She knew she couldn't take the documents with her, so she transformed the truth into music. Martha reached a particular passage in the sheet music, a sequence of notes that made Mr. Thompson lean forward in his armchair. The notes, he murmured. They form a code. Sarah was brilliant. She transformed the dates, the document numbers, everything into musical notation. Professor Miller nodded. And not just that. The structure of the piece, the intervals between the notes, their coordinates, directions to find something hidden in this house. Victor laughed nervously. This is absurd. No one could transform documents into music. Sarah could, replied the professor, and she left enough clues so that one day someone could discover the truth. That's why Mr. Thompson needed someone new learning piano, someone who could play the piece without prejudice, without knowing its history. Martha continued playing, each note revealing more of the mystery. Buried for decades, the music spoke of usurped inheritance, hidden documents, of a young woman forced to abandon everything that was rightfully hers. But there's more, said Mr. Thompson, his voice choked. Sarah didn't leave alone. She took with her something, even more precious than her inheritance, something that would forever change the fate of this family. The silence that followed Mr. Thompson's declaration was broken only by the notes of the piano, which continued to flow under Martha's fingers. Rebecca, who until then had maintained a posture of disbelief, approached her father with hesitant steps. "What else did Sarah take with her, Dad?" she asked, her voice betraying a vulnerability hidden until then. Mr. Thompson raised his gaze to his daughter, his eyes shining with contained tears. "She took your sister, Rebecca. Sarah left pregnant, expecting a child who was also a Thompson." RD1. Revelation hit everyone like a wave. Rebecca staggered, needing to lean on a nearby armchair. Victor let out an exclamation of surprise, while Dr. Vance began to frantically leaf through the documents in his briefcase. "Impossible," murmured Rebecca. "I would be the only—" "Mom always said—" "Your mother didn't know," interrupted Mr. Thompson. "No one knew except me and—" He cast a significant look at Professor Miller, who nodded slightly. Martha, still at the piano, noticed a change in the sheet music. The notes began to form a different pattern, more urgent, more revealing. Professor Miller, noticing the same thing, leaned over the piano with renewed interest. "This passage," he said, pointing to a specific sequence of notes. "They're not just coordinates, they're dates, numbers, a complete record." Mr. Thompson agreed. Sarah documented everything in the music, The birth of the child, the documents that proved her inheritance, and something else. Something she discovered about the Thompson family that would change everything. Victor, who had been unusually quiet, approached the piano. "And where? Here's this child now, must be almost my age." "Exactly your age, Victor," replied Mr. Thompson, fixing a penetrating gaze on his nephew. "In fact, you know her very well." The room seemed to freeze. Martha felt her fingers stumble on the keys, but Professor Miller gently guided her back to the correct rhythm. "What are you talking about, Uncle?" asked Victor, his voice trembling slightly. "Your mother, Amanda, never told you the truth about—" "Your adoption, did she?" Mr. Thompson asked softly. "About how she found you?" Victor staggered as if he had taken a blow. "No, it can't be. Sarah entrusted you to Amanda's care before disappearing," continued Mr. Thompson. "She knew she couldn't keep you safe while fighting to recover her inheritance. Amanda, who couldn't have children, promised to raise you as her own son, keeping your true identity a secret." Rebecca, who had remained in shock, suddenly stood up. "So Victor is Sarah's son, the true heir?" "One of the heirs," corrected Mr. Thompson. "Sarah had twins." The piano music reached a crescendo, the notes intertwining in a web of revelations. Martha, guided by the sheet music and Professor Miller, felt as if each pressed key unraveled another piece of the puzzle. "The documents that Sarah hid," continued Professor Miller, "not only prove her inheritance, but also the existence of the children. She transformed everything into music, knowing that one day someone would decipher the code." "And the other twin?" asked Dr. Vance, who until then had been observing everything with growing interest. "Where is he?" Mr. Thompson smiled sadly. "Closer than you imagine. Sarah ensured that her children were protected even if separated. One stayed with Amanda, becoming Victor. The other—" At this moment, Martha reached a specific part of the sheet music, a sequence of notes that made Professor Miller's eyes widen. "This passage," he said, his voice barely containing the emotion, "they're not just notes. It's a name." Mr. Thompson nodded. Sarah was meticulous. She even coded the names of the people involved. The true names, not the ones that were given later to protect the children. Martha felt a shiver run down her spine when Professor Miller pointed to a specific sequence of notes. There was something familiar about that pattern, something that seemed to resonate with a long-forgotten truth. Martha felt her fingers trembling on the piano keys as Professor Miller pointed to the sequence of notes that formed the coded name. The room was in complete silence, except for the melody that continued to reveal its secrets. "Rebecca," said Mr. Thompson softly, "you never wondered why your mother insisted so much on keeping you away from the piano, why she refused to let you learn music?" Rebecca, still stunned by the previous revelations, shook her head negatively. She said that music was a waste of time for a Thompson." "No," replied Mr. Thompson. "She feared that music would awaken something in you, something that's in your blood, in your DNA, the same talent that Sarah had." Victor approached Rebecca, studying her face as if seeing her for the first time. "It can't be. Rebecca is your twin sister," completed Professor Miller, without taking his eyes off the sheet music. "Sarah entrusted each of the twins to a different family. Victor went to Amanda, and Rebecca—" He made a significant pause. "Rebecca was adopted by your Uncle Edward and his wife." Rebecca staggered, needing to lean on the piano. The notes sounded dissonant with the abrupt movement, creating a cacophony that seemed to mirror the emotional chaos in the room. "No," she exclaimed. "I am a legitimate daughter. Mom, she never—" "Your mother, my late wife," interrupted Mr. Thompson gently, "accepted you as our daughter the moment Sarah placed you in her arms. She preferred not to know the complete truth, so she could love you without reservations as her true daughter." Martha, guided by Professor Miller, began to play a new section of the sheet music. The melody now was softer, almost a lullaby. "This part," explained the professor, "Sarah composed especially for you two. It's a message for her children, coded in a melody that she hoped one day you could hear together." Dr. Vance, who had been taking notes furiously, cleared his throat. This completely changes the legal situation of the inheritance. If we can prove the documents exist, interrupted Mr. Thompson. Sarah didn't just rely on music to preserve the truth. She left concrete evidence, hidden where only someone who deciphered the sheet music could find. Victor approached Rebecca hesitantly. Despite all the previous disputes, there was now a different look between them, a recognition, a long-lost connection. "That's why the piano is so important," said Martha, finally understanding. "It's not just an instrument, it's a safe that guards the truth." Professor Miller nodded. Sarah knew she needed to protect not only the documents but also her children. Music was her way of ensuring that the truth would survive, even if she wasn't here to reveal it. "But where is Sarah now?" asked Rebecca, her voice choked. Our real mother?" Mr. Thompson exchanged a significant look with Professor Miller. "The sheet music contains that answer too. Keep playing, Martha." The following notes formed an even more complex pattern. Professor Miller began to decipher them, translating the music into coordinates and dates. "Sarah never stopped fighting for the truth," explained Mr. Thompson. "She spent years gathering evidence, documenting everything, preparing for the moment when her children could claim their rightful place. But she needed to stay away to protect them." "And now?" asked Victor, his voice betraying a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Now," replied Professor Miller, "thanks to Martha and the piano, we can finally complete what Sarah started. The last part of the sheet music will lead us to her." The music reached a new movement, the notes flowing with renewed urgency. Martha felt as if the piano itself was anxious to reveal its last secrets, to finally reunite the long-separated family. Night had fallen over the Thompson mansion, and the piano room was illuminated, only by the last rays of the setting sun and a few old lamps. Shadows danced on the walls as Martha continued to play, her hands now firmer on the keys, guided by renewed determination. Rebecca and Victor sat side by side on a nearby sofa, their faces reflecting the whirlwind of emotions that the revelations had provoked. Occasionally they exchanged hesitant glances, as if trying to find traces of each other that they had never noticed before. "You have the same eyes," observed Mr. Thompson softly. "Sarah's eyes, and when you smile, it's like seeing her again." Professor Miller continued deciphering the sheet music, making quick notes in a notebook. "These coordinates," he murmured, "don't point to a distant place. In fact, they indicate a location right here in New York City." "Sarah never strayed far," explained Mr. Thompson. "She needed to be close enough to protect her children, even if she couldn't be with them." Dr. Vance, who had been organizing his documents, cleared his throat to get attention. "I must warn that legally we'll need concrete evidence beyond the sheet music, birth certificates, adoption documents." "The documents are all here," interrupted Professor Miller, pointing to a specific sequence of notes. Sarah transformed each location into a musical progression. The piano doesn't just hold the music, but also the map to all the evidence. Martha reached a particularly complex part of the sheet music, where the notes seemed to dance in an intricate pattern. Professor Miller leaned in with renewed interest. "This is brilliant," he exclaimed. Sarah used a composition system based on Morse code. Each sequence of notes corresponds to a letter, forming precise instructions. Rebecca stood up, approaching the piano. "So our mother, she planned all this, every detail." "Sarah was meticulous," replied Mr. Thompson. "She knew she would need an infallible plan to protect the truth and her children. Music was her language, her way of preserving the story for when the right moment came." Victor, who had remained silent for a long time, finally spoke. "Why now? Why did you decide to reveal all this now?" Mr. Thompson smiled sadly. "Because Sarah made me promise that I would wait until you were both ready, until the piano could reunite the family again." Martha continued playing, each note revealing more of Sarah's intricate plan. Professor Miller translated the coordinates and instructions, assembling a map that would lead them not only to the documents, but also to Sarah herself. "There's something else in the notes," the professor suddenly said. A personal message for you two. He signaled for Martha to play a specific sequence. The melody that followed was different from anything they had heard until then. It was a lullaby, simple and deeply emotional. Rebecca brought her hands to her lips, tears streaming down her face. "I know this music," she whispered. "Mum, my adoptive mother, used to sing it to me when I was little." "I know it, too," said Victor, his voice choked. "It always calmed me when I had nightmares." "Sarah taught the song to both mothers," explained Mr. Thompson. "It was her way of being present in your lives, even from a distance." Professor Miller continued translating the last notes of the sheet music. "The final instructions are clear. There's a meeting scheduled for tomorrow at noon. Sarah will be waiting at the location indicated by the coordinates." "After so long," murmured Rebecca, "we're finally going to meet our real mother." "And recover what is rightfully yours," added Dr. Vance, surprising everyone with his now more understanding tone. "With the documents that Sarah preserved, we can legally restore the Thompson inheritance to its true heirs." Martha played the last notes of the sheet music, and a silence laden with expectation filled the room. The piano, which for so many years had guarded the family's secrets, had fulfilled its mission. Morning arrived at the Thompson mansion, bringing with it an almost palpable atmosphere of expectation. Martha, who had barely slept, found Rebecca in the garden at the first rays of sunlight, contemplating the horizon with distant eyes. "I couldn't close my eyes," Rebecca confessed, noticing the housekeeper's approach. "I spent the entire night thinking about all the times I felt that something was incomplete in my life, as if a part of me was missing." "And now you know what it was," Martha replied softly. "Or rather, who it was." Victor joined them moments later, carrying an old box he had found in the attic. "Look at this," he said, carefully opening it. "They're old photographs of the mansion, and look at this one." The photograph in question showed a young woman sitting at the piano, her face illuminated by a radiant smile. The resemblance to Rebecca was striking. "Sarah," Rebecca whispered, touching the photograph with trembling fingers. "Our mother." Professor Miller arrived early, bringing with him maps of the city and the notes he had made from the sheet music. Mr. Thompson awaited them in the library, where they had spread everything out on the large oak table. "The coordinates lead us to an old house in the Upper East Side," explained the professor, marking the location on the map. "A residence that, according to my research, has belonged to a cultural foundation for decades." "The Bernstein Foundation," completed Mr. Thompson. Sarah was always passionate about American music. She found a perfect place to hide in plain sight, giving piano lessons to underprivileged children. Dr. Vance, who had decided to accompany them to the meeting to ensure the legal legitimacy of everything, was organizing the necessary documents. "We'll need to officially record this moment," he explained. "It's crucial for the process of restoring the inheritance." Martha observed the preparations with a mixture of emotion and melancholy. Her role as a catalyst for this reunion was coming to an end, but something in Mr. Thompson's gaze told her that her participation in the Thompson family's story was far from over. "Martha," called Mr. Thompson, gesturing for her to come closer, "there's something that Sarah left especially for you in the sheet music. Albert, show her." The professor pulled out an additional sheet from his notes. "This sequence of notes, they're not coordinates or instructions. It's a personal message for you." "For me?" asked Martha, surprised. "But how could Sarah know?" "Sarah knew that one day someone with a pure heart would need to learn to play the piano for the truth to come out," explained Mr. Thompson. "She left specific instructions on how to recognize that person." Professor Miller began to translate the message, "To the one who will make the music speak when silence can no longer guard the truth. Your role in this story is not by chance. You are also part of it, more than you imagine." Rebecca and Victor approached, intrigued. The professor continued. "Sarah left one last secret to be revealed only when everyone was gathered. Something about Martha's true connection to the Thompson family. But that will have to wait," interrupted Mr. Thompson, looking at the clock. "It's time. Sarah is waiting for us." The group prepared to leave, Rebecca and Victor, now united by a bond that transcended their old differences, remained close. Dr. Vance organized his last documents, while Professor Miller carefully stored the sheet music and notes. Martha took one last look at the piano before they left. The instrument, which had guarded the family's secrets for so long, seemed different, now more alive, as if it too was awaiting the moment of reunion. "Ready?" asked Mr. Thompson, offering his arm to her. Martha nodded, feeling that she was about to discover not only the outcome of the Thompson family's story, but also something fundamental about her own place in it. The piano had kept more than just Sarah's memories. It had also kept the path to a future that none of them could have imagined. The midday sun bathed the Art Deco facade of the old house on the Upper East Side. Martha, Rebecca, Victor, Mr. Thompson, Professor Miller, and Dr. Vance stopped in front of the wrought iron gate of the Bernstein Foundation. The sound of a piano reached them softly through the open windows. "It's the same melody," whispered Rebecca, recognizing the notes of the lullaby that both she and Victor had known since childhood. Professor Miller smiled, nodding. "Sarah always gives lessons at this time. She never stopped playing, never stopped teaching. Music was her way of staying connected to you even from a distance." As they entered the mansion, they were greeted by a gray-haired lady with an elegant posture who interrupted her lesson upon seeing them. Her eyes, identical to Rebecca's and Victor's, filled with tears. "My children," said Sarah, her melodious voice filling the room, "finally." The reunion was a moment of profound emotion. Rebecca and Victor ran into their mother's arms, decades of absence dissolving in an embrace that seemed to contain all the love repressed for so long. "You're even more beautiful than in the photographs Albert brought me," said Sarah, touching her children's faces with trembling hands. Professor Miller, who had served as a secret link between mother and children all those years, smiled emotionally. Mr. Thompson approached the group, leaning on his cane. "Sarah," he said, "I kept my promise. Your children are safe, and now the truth can finally come to light." Sarah nodded, then turning to Martha, who was observing the scene with tears in her eyes. "And you, my dear, made all this possible, but you still don't know how truly connected you are to this story, do you?" Martha felt her heart race as Sarah approached her, holding her hands between hers. "These hands," said Sarah softly, "are so similar to those of my younger sister, Claire." "Your sister?" asked Martha, feeling as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "Claire was my younger sister," explained Sarah. "When I was forced to leave, she was expecting a baby, a girl. She could never tell the child's father about the pregnancy and ended up giving the baby up for adoption to protect her from the same dangers that drove me away from my children." "Me?" whispered Martha, the pieces finally falling into place. "Yes," confirmed Sarah. "You are my niece, Martha, Rebecca and Victor's cousin. Fate worked in mysterious ways to bring you back to the Thompson family so you could help reveal the truth through music." Dr. Vance, who was following everything with professional interest, cleared his throat softly. "I have here all the necessary documents," he said. "Certificates, records, proof of legitimate inheritance. We can start the restoration process today." "The inheritance is important," said Sarah, "but the real treasure we recovered today is our family." Rebecca and Victor agreed, still marveling at the revelations. Martha, now understanding her true place in that story, finally felt complete. "The piano fulfilled its mission," said Professor Miller. "It kept not only documents and truths, but also the path that brought us here." Sarah went to the room's piano, her hands gliding lovingly over the keys. "This is no longer a story of secrets and separations," she said. "It's a story of reunions and new beginnings." With a smile, she began to play the same lullaby that had cradled her children from afar for so many years. But now, for the first time, Rebecca and Victor could hear the music directly from their mother's hands. Martha observed the scene with her heart overflowing with emotion. The piano, which for so long had kept the Thompson secrets, now witnessed the family reunion. The soft notes filled the room like a promise that from that moment on, the music in the Thompson mansion would no longer speak of absences and secrets, but of love, union, and new beginnings. And so, under the sweet melody of the piano, a new story began to be written, no longer in coded sheet music or hidden documents, but in the smiles and embraces of a finally reunited family, ready to build a future where truth and love could finally flow free like the music that had brought them back home.